Did you know that Vikings weren't just great warriors, but were also surprisingly big on good hygiene? Many people think Vikings were rash and dirty, but apparently they were very organized and much cleaner than you might imagine. Today, we're going to show you what Viking society was like, the ranks, and even how they managed to stay healthy. You've just gotta stick to the very end because there's so much for you in this video. Mind-blowing fact number 1, your favorite pendant might actually have a Viking origin. The Viking culture has been a marvel for people of all ages. You see them in movies and read about them in books, but it's hard to tell what's true about them and what are just cooked up stories. Yet in all the stories you've seen or read, they're portrayed as great warriors, but guess what? There's so much more to them in reality. Even though Vikings are commonly imagined as wild, bloodthirsty fighters who destroy villages, they were actually much more civilized than people might think. During most of the Viking Age, there were 3 main social classes: thralls, carls, and jarls. Later on, kings and queens became part of society too. Thralls were the enslaved people, the lowest class in Viking society. They had no rights and were often treated like property, even being used as currency in trade. Many were born into slavery, while others became slaves by losing battles or falling into deep poverty. Carls were free people, one step above the thralls. They had legal protection, could own land, and many even became Viking warriors. Most Vikings who went on raids were from this class, working as farmers when they weren't fighting, while the jarls were the wealthiest and the most powerful. They didn't do hard labor, often leading others into battle as chieftains or warlords. Even when kings and queens appeared later in Viking society, the jarls stayed wealthy and important, overseeing large land areas for the king. The Vikings used this 3-class system to organize their society, and each person's role shaped how they interacted with others. Interestingly, while these 3 classes were clear, a person could change their status, whether they went up or down, depended on their actions and whether people saw them as honorable or not. So, while the Vikings had a structured society, hard work and good character could sometimes lead to a better life. Speaking about a better life, the Vikings were really mindful of that, especially with their hygiene and health. Vikings were surprisingly clean and took great care of their appearance. They were known to bathe once a week, which was far more often than most people, especially compared to Europeans of the time. They used grooming tools made from animal bones like combs, razors, and ear cleaners to keep themselves tidy. Even though we often hear about their weapons, many Viking graves contain grooming items such as tweezers, combs, toothpicks, and washing bowls. As one historian said, Vikings believed in looking good and dressing well, something we tend to forget today. For the Vikings, looking clean and well-groomed was important to their success and reputation, showing that they cared just as much about personal hygiene as they did about battles. The Viking diet was healthy and balanced, with various foods to keep them strong. Since they were hunters, meat was a big part of their meals. Depending on where they lived, they ate pork, mutton, and sometimes elk, deer, or goat. Vikings even ate horse meat. Living near water, they also ate a lot of fish, seal, and whale meat. They mostly boiled their meat, making stews or broth. Bread made from whole grains was another common food, and if it got stale, they would soak it in stew to make it soft. Vikings also enjoyed wild vegetables like white carrots, turnips, and cabbage, along with herbs and spices to add flavor. They ate seeds, nuts, and fruits like apples, berries, and plums, so they probably stayed pretty healthy. Vikings still faced some health problems despite their healthy diet, especially from battle wounds and illnesses. Parasites like worms were also a big issue, coming from their food and the fact that they often lived close to their animals, which had parasites. Additionally, Vikings' teeth weren't always the best sight you'd want to see. Studies of Viking skeletons reveal they often had gum disease and tartar buildup, But something surprising was found when looking at the remains of Viking warriors from the 10th and 11th centuries in Weymouth, England. Some of them had filed marks or stripes into their teeth. These marks were carefully done on the two upper front teeth. No one knows for sure why they did this, but some think it was decorative, to show their status as warriors, or even to scare their enemies. Other Viking skeletons have been found with 3 or 4 teeth that had these marks. Even though Vikings are often thought of as rough and dirty, they were actually quite clean and cared about their appearance. They wore fine clothes and jewelry, and even Christian writers who didn't like the Vikings admitted that they paid attention to their appearance. Vikings wore clothes made of wool, linen, and animal hides, and the wealthy even wore silks. They often carried combs made from antler, bone, ivory, or wood, and upper-class Vikings wore silver, gold, and gemstone jewelry. The lower class used simpler materials like tin, lead, and iron. Their shoes and boots were made of animal hide and didn't have heels. Most Vikings, except for enslaved people, took great pride in their appearance. They started each day with grooming, and Saturday was dedicated to bathing and washing clothes, which puzzled the Anglo-Saxons. Many Vikings believed in looking their best, partly because they didn't know when they might die and wanted to be ready for the afterlife. Norse poetry, like the Havamal, even advised starting the day combed and washed, since no one knew where they might end up by nightfall. Vikings believed that when a person died, their soul would arrive in the afterlife looking just as they did in life. For example, the heroes of Valhalla were thought to keep the same armor and weapons they had when they died. Because of this, Vikings took grooming seriously, ensuring they were always presentable in case they met the gods or joined those who had passed before them. Keeping clean and well-dressed was also thought to help maintain cosmic order and delay the end of the world, known as Ragnarok. Christian writers often painted Vikings as brutal invaders, but sometimes they couldn't hide their jealousy of how well groomed and polite the Vikings were. As one account complained, the Danes made themselves too acceptable to English women by their elegant manners and their care of their person. They combed their hair daily, bathed every Saturday, and changed their clothes often. These good habits, along with their charm, made it easier for Vikings to win the hearts of women, even those from noble families. The English weren't just upset with the Vikings because of their better grooming habits, but it also added to the tensions in Britain. Vikings' cleanliness, like taking baths and changing their underwear, gave them an edge in winning the hearts of local women, which didn't sit well with the Anglo-Saxons. However, Viking hygiene was just one part of their charm. They also paid much attention to their clothing and accessories. Vikings dressed in layers, starting with linen underwear. While there's no solid proof of what undergarments they wore, it's believed men and women had undershirts and possibly underbreeches. Over that, men wore a knee-length tunic and trousers, which could be loose or fitted. They wore belts around their waists, from which they might hang a knife, a purse, or charms. The tunic would be tucked above the belt and fell to the middle of the thigh. For jarls or carls, this would be the basic outfit. A jarl might add a cloak, sometimes lined with fur or decorative silk. Cloaks, jackets, and tunics were sometimes embroidered with gold or silver thread, making them look even more impressive. Both jarls and carls would wear some kind of jewelry, like necklaces, armbands, or headpieces, to keep their hair in place. On the other hand, thralls had a simpler outfit. A wool tunic tied at the waist with a belt or rope. Viking women dressed similarly to men, but often had more detailed accessories. They wore decorated shoes or boots, and their necklaces, made of polished beads, gemstones, silver, or gold, were more elaborate than those worn by men. While men's jewelry was a little simpler, women's jewelry had more designs and was more beautiful. Neck rings, usually worn by men, were made of twisted metal rods, sometimes holding a gem or amulet. Women's necklaces, however, were more elaborate. Both men and women wore finger and arm rings, though arm rings often had special, social, or ceremonial meanings. Pendants were also very popular, especially those that honored the gods. They could be shaped like a throne, like Odin's horse, or in other different forms, but the most common shape was in the form of Thor's hammer, Mjolnir, which they believed protected whoever wore it and gives great strength to face life's challenges. What do you think? Has this been some shocking stuff you've seen? Well, there's gonna be more in the next video. I'll see you then.